He beat me to it a little bit before we started. And Fernando, you just were saying that the United States just listed the Houthis as, if I understand corrected, they put them back into the terrorist group. Can you a little bit clarify that to people like me in the audience? What does it mean? What are we actually talking about in terms of them being listed as a terror group? What kind of a listing is that? Just 2 minutes, a little bit of the recent development, just your analysis on it.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Welcome to everyone. Yes, just the breaking news a few minutes ago, social media reporting the statement from National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan on the listing of the Houthis as a special designated terrorist group. So this is a specially designated global terrorist. So this is, for those of you who are not very familiar with U.S. policy, this is an automatic or an easier path for the U.S. administration to deal with such non-state actors like the Houthis. If you recall, in January 2021, Trump administration listed them as a foreign terrorist organization. At the time, it included the specially designated listing. So it was the two of them, and merely expanded the access of U.S. institutions to track the Houthis and be able to identify violations and then further pursue specific sanctions against individuals or companies, as we've seen. To your question on how does this impact the situation? Unfortunately, the U.S. administration is very bad at drafting these listings because they are such in a hurry to just put it out there to meet the demand, to relieve the pressure, the political pressure that President Biden is under. I suspect that this is not a very detailed listing. Let's keep in mind that the U.S. Government has the most extensive sanctions against the Houthis, sanctions since 2014. Which the UN has not yet caught up to. This was an issue that we faced when I was on the UN panel. To Dr. Brehony's initial question about how this may impact the delivery of humanitarian aid, always been a primary concern in the international community since 2014 and then in 2021 with the Trump administration. There are two ways to look at it. Number one, the US will automatically reach out to the international community, the UN organizations, and make exemptions for this because the US is not about to halt or obstruct the delivery of humanitarian aid. The other side is that for the past 2 years, the UN has requested $4.3 billion to cover the humanitarian response in Yemen, mostly in northern Yemen. In both years, the international community has only delivered pledges of $1.3 billion. They have delivered the 1.3 billion. They've pledged 1.3 billion. So if we look at reports from the UN, they've actually delivered over 50% of that money. The Gulf countries have covered to about 2.5 billion each, but directly through their own humanitarian organizations. The next thing that we need to remember is if you're on social media, you can look up this on Twitter. There is an excellent tracking account that looks at the ship flow into Hodeidah port, which is controlled by the Houthis. Since the beginning of 2023, the traffic has increased, has almost tripled. So, this is as a result of the détente with Saudi Arabia since April 1st, 2022. So when we look at this, I'm more interested in how is it going to affect this particular traffic into Hodeidah port rather than the humanitarian issue.
So you touch about that, and I wanna raise this question to both Noel and to Matthew, and I'll start with Noel and then Matthew, if you can jump in. You touch about and I'm kind of going back to the 10th. I mean, October 23, we kind of see this escalation, obviously directly related to the war with Gaza. And then we see that the 10th and the whole discussion about a peace agreement that was going on with Saudi Arabia. that are kind of I wouldn't say disappear, but it was kind of put aside with this situation. So, Noel, I want to ask you first, where are we at when it comes to the situation in the fighting between the Saudis and the Houthis? Is that something that's going to go and continue? Is that going to renew? Is that putting basically a de-escalated situation that's going to remain de-escalated? How do you see this thing evolving now, considering what is going on in the past few months?
Well, I mean, they had apparently reached an outline deal in December. In fact, it was announced by the UN Special Envoy, and the expectation was that after some more discussions, it would be signed. But that's all been put to one side because of the situation in the Red Sea. But Saudi Arabia is very interesting. It has been urging restraint on the coalition and the people. I mean, for Saudi Arabia, this deal is important. They have been negotiating it for best part of a year, if not more, and they want to prevent any further drone attacks or missile attacks on Saudi Arabia, which were happening in the past. And they also have, of course, a major interest in the Red Sea themselves, apart from the long coast. A lot of the investment, the Vision 2030, the Foreign Direct Investment, which is being brought in, development that now the new city in the north, is very important to Mohammed bin Salman's vision and economic future. So for Saudi Arabia, this has been a serious issue, and the question and the uncertainty now is whether what is happening will delay that signature, or whether it may eventually stop it, because we don't know quite where this situation is going. So for Saudi Arabia, this is, I think, an important factor. I don't know how the foreign designation will affect it, but maybe others can. But it's certainly last time it was the main concern was over humanitarian, but it does actually impact the Houthi regime, because whatever we may think about the Houthis, they are actually in control of 70, some people say 80% of Yemen's population, and they have a government of sort which operates there.
So I want to ask Matthew if you can a little bit enlighten us also on the position of the actor that I think is not getting I would say enough attention when it comes to this situation, right? The UAE is a very involved actor. Is a very an actor that has a lot of interest when it comes to this conflict. And I think they don't see eye to eye with Saudis when it comes to the crisis here. So I would like to hear your side of this when it comes to how does the UAE see this entire situation right now, this crisis right now, and where do we see this from the perspective of escalation and de-escalation?
Sure. Oren, thank you very much for having me, and for everybody else for attending. The UAE has always had its sights set on expanding a somewhat of a modern empire within South Yemen. It has been much more antagonistic towards Iran, and somewhat aggressive in terms of its standing and posture towards Iran. But like Saudi Arabia, Abu Dhabi does not want a broader escalation to occur. It's for that reason that both Saudi Arabia and the UAE did not participate in the American combined fleet to protect the Red Sea. The Saudis and the Emiratis try to demonstrate how the Houthi attacks are directly linked to events in Gaza, and so it's part of an international issue. The last thing that the Saudis or the Emiratis wanted would be to be brought back in to Yemen in such a full-scale way. Now, that said, there is, from Abu Dhabi's perspective, there's no way there can be long-term security and stability within Yemen if there is a Houthi government. And this is where it comes back full circle to the fundamental flaws and failures of the Saudi-led coalition to have achieved its aims and goals to have removed the Houthis from power. This is also one of the pinnacle reasons why there is such tension between the UAE and Saudi Arabia since 2015 is because of their diverging strategies in this area. For the Emiratis, they do not want to escalate this any further, but at the same time, they are, and their proxies in South Yemen, the STC, are heavily they're advocating for further attacks against the Houthis. They are trying to increase Western security involvement within the region after a prolonged period when this wasn't the case. No matter Abu Dhabi's growing potential shift towards China, towards Russia, they still understand that the principal defense and support that they would have against any Iranian aggression would still come from the West. So as a result, they're needing to maintain a balance that doesn't escalate tensions too far, but that also prepares themselves for any potential long-term repercussions.
So, Fernando, I wanna go back to you, and Matthew spoke about how the Saudis and the both the Emiratis are not part of the U.S.-led coalition in the Red Sea. And I want to ask you, Fernando, if you can give us your perspective in terms of the effectiveness and the possibility of this Red Sea coalition led by the United States to actually lead to a de-escalation, or at the very least to deter the Houthis from continuing actions, or if not, will this be kind of a lead to an escalation, something that the Houthis will basically expand their attacks in the Red Sea? So how do you see this U.S.-led coalition in the Red Sea basically playing out in the upcoming, let's say, months in terms of how we see the situation escalating or de-escalating?
Sorry, was that for me? Or
yes, for you, Fernando.
Sorry, apologies. Sorry. My internet kept going off. Definitely, this is something that definitely needs more attention. And you brought up right before we began, the versus re-escalation, right, or de-escalation. And I think that we have to keep a timeline in mind in order to best define this process of escalation or de-escalation. It is definitely, from my perspective, from my timeline, is definitely a Houthi escalation. And what I've tried to do in my writing, in my analysis, is to push sort of a narrative, a perspective that decouples the Houthi operations from the war in Gaza. There has to be a clear understanding that the war in Gaza is a mere instrument of propaganda for the Houthis. They began with their speeches. The Houthis leaders began with their speeches after October, mid-October, when the war, when the IDF went into Gaza, demanding that Saudi Arabia allow them passage through Saudi territory to send troops to southern Israel. And then they demanded that Saudi Arabia allow them access to their airspace in order to launch missiles. This proved that Houthis had not launched any missiles toward Saudi Arabia, toward Israel. It had been Iraqi and Syrian militia, right? To the détente with Saudi Arabia is based on an end, halting cross-border attacks by both Houthis and Saudis. At the beginning of this conflict, Saudi Arabia didn't know if those drones or missiles claimed by the Houthis were going to Jeddah, any other city in Saudi, or they were indeed going to an Israeli city. I believe that the Houthis have escalated in order to leverage their and vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia in their demands. Let's keep in mind as well that the Houthis' priority at the moment is an agreement with Saudi Arabia, not an agreement with Yemeni rivals on the ground, and not an end of the war on the ground in Yemen. They're not done with their ambitions in Yemen. The basis for this relation, these talks between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis, is because the Houthis need legitimacy that can only come from the Saudis, not just Iran, but the Saudis. They need economic stability, which can only flow from Saudi Arabia. Since 1967, Saudi Arabia has been the primary patron of Yemen Arab Republic, and then later on the Republic of Yemen. When we look at, keep in mind that at early September last year, Houthi delegation traveled to Riyadh to continue the talks that began in 2022. The Houthis had initially agreed to a deal with Saudi Arabia to extend into a ceasefire, not just at the time, but into a ceasefire. Houthi and Saudi granted further concessions, access to the Sana'a airport, access to the Hodeidah airport. Then the Houthis started kicking the can down the road when the UN General Assembly meetings began in September in New York, because the Houthis saw that the chairman of the Political Leadership Council attended New York along with the head of the Southern Transitional Council, the pro-secessionist group. This was a big threat politically and diplomatically to the Houthis, because it was legitimizing the Southern issue as well. And so keep in mind also that right before October 6th, 2023, we had momentum gaining in the narrative of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, right? We had Blinken visited Saudi Arabia about 3 times within 30 days. This was to Iran and to the Houthis. So as a member of resistance, we can see how the Houthis have utilized. Also keep in mind that the Houthis have threatened ships along the Red Sea since they were expelled from Aden in 2015. They attacked Saudi ships, Emirati ships. They hijacked an Emirati ship 2019, I believe, 2018. Since October 2022, Houthis attacked oil infrastructure facilities in southern Yemen and oil tankers at Belhaf and at Hadramaut. This is nothing new. This is a Houthi tactic, and it's an escalation from their part. Let's keep in mind that Operation Prosperity Guardian is framed by the US and its allies as a defensive operation, right? A defense of these ships, a defense of maritime traffic. When we talk about where Saudi is, this operation is based in Bahrain. We know Bahrain is in this operation, not only because it hosts US Navy, but because it's a proxy from Saudi Arabia, right? It's acting as a proxy from Saudi Arabia. The US and its allies are collecting intelligence from Bahrain or in Bahrain, and the operation is handled from Bahrain. So what we see with these attacks already 3 days ago by the US and the British forces, it's interesting to note that it was about 20 targets, military targets. Some were known military targets, other are new military targets. So when we really analyze where the strikes took place, whether in Sana'a, Sada, which borders Saudi Arabia, or Hajjah, we need to look at the facilities that were hit by the Brits and by the British Air Force and the US forces. It is very, it is, we need insight into this, and we need to discuss the importance of these targets to the Houthis. These are places that are used to manufacture drone parts, to assemble missiles and drones. And also, these were factories that were repairing helicopters and F-5s for the Houthis, which were, let's be honest, they were not combat ready or efficient, but nonetheless allowed the Houthis a little bit of propaganda.
So at this point, I want to ask you, I think there is, let's call it a perception that there is, that the Houthis are nothing more than a proxy of Iran doing as they told by the government in Tehran. And I think that one of the insights, at least I'm getting through this webinar, is that we shouldn't be looking at the Houthis just as a proxy, but as the Houthis as their own actor playing on their own interests, using opportunities in order to push their own interests in the region versus those actors such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and so on. How would you describe, from an escalation, de-escalation, Iran's role in their impact, influence, and ability to control the Houthis? Is that something that you see, something that pressuring Iran maybe is the key, or do you see that maybe the pressure in Iran is not necessarily lead to the results that the coalition would like to see. You're on mute, Noel. You're on mute. Noel, you're on mute. Okay, now you're not.
No, I certainly see the Houthis as their own actor, a convenient ally for Iran. Putting it simply, the Houthis, developed entirely within Yemen. They have a particular ideology, religious fixture, which is obviously it's very much their own. It's different from the 12ish year of the Iran and Iraq. It's very much from the Zaydi traditions of the old Yemen, which and one of the effects of this is to the Houthis really see themselves as a special people, and that Yemen should be controlled by descendants of the prophets, which are the families, the Hashemite families, as they call them, in which the Houthis belong. So they have really developed themselves, and I watched their emergence. I was doing a series of studies from about 2008 onwards. I could see the way the Houthis moved from a relatively small situation as they were in their home province of Sada, how they gradually took over the adjacent provinces using a combination of militias and politics. The Houthis are from a small tribal federation in an area where the major tribal federations of Yemen are quite weak, and they have a particular deep knowledge of tribal politics. And their advance towards Sana'a was a combination of militias and negotiating with tribes. And through this combination, they were able to take over North Yemen in 2014, in alliance in the latter part of that with Ali Abdullah Saleh, the previous president. So they were able to absorb his army and part of his political apparatus in setting up their own regime. So this is where they are. It's very much a Yemeni body, but from the outset, particularly from 2014 onwards, they've had certainly support from Iran, and they probably had support before in that advance to Sana'a. And that report over the years has gradually increased. The weaponry provided has been more sophisticated. There's been technology transfer. There's been IRGC clearly has involvement in training and in that technology transfer. And the Iranians are clearly smuggling weapons in. And I think that there was an interception yesterday, which is one of a number that have taken place. This is presumed by most people to be only the thin edge of the web. It's very much more is getting through than is blocked. So the Iranians, therefore, are a key ally of theirs, but they are not in any way a control. The Houthis are an ally of Saudi Arabia. Whether their decision to escalate in the Red Sea was inspired by Iran, I don't know. My guess, my assumption of everything I've seen of the Houthis, it was their decision, but one which Iran has found convenient, and Iran may have encouraged, and I think Iran would be quite happy with. So I think that is the relationship between them. They should very much seen as their own actor, but with Iranian support, and very much, and certainly part of what they call the axis of resistance, and a successful part from the Iranian point of view.
And Matthew, I want to ask you from the perspective of how do you see this crisis going on? If tomorrow it ends, will this lead to the formation of a naval alliance that we'll see in the Red Sea with the UAE, Saudi Arabia? I mean, what sort of I would say, security implications could this lead when it comes to the UAE strategic posture when it comes in the Red Sea? How would the UAE take this crisis in order to learn from it and apply a change in strategy, or move forward with a certain strategy more stronger? How do you see the UAE responding to this crisis from the perspective of their own regional military power in the region?
So, as it's well known that the Emiratis, a huge part of their foreign policy is the establishment of a huge commercial political network based around ports, and this has grown immensely through the Red Sea, the Horn of Africa. this is of immense strategic value, not just to the UAE for its own economy, but also for Russia's north-south corridor in being able to sustain its logistical access, its transport, its own foreign policy, as well as being a key enabler within China's Belt and Road Initiative. This is why, say, the events in Ethiopia and Somaliland recently are, in my mind, directly connected. The Emirati approach is to work with local security forces from these countries and have them trained by an external third-party actor. At the moment, this is being undertaken by Russian persons affiliated with the former Wagner Group through Uganda. There are attempts to strengthen Somaliland and Puntland maritime security capabilities. They are also doing this with the STC. They are trying to help and strengthen Tariq Saleh's own position in Mocha in one of the last remnants of North Yemen. But they will nearly always use it as part of something which can be exploited to integrate and justify another foreign state taking the responsibility, because fundamentally their own deficiencies in terms of manpower capabilities, they do not have the amount of people able and necessary to undertake these initiatives. It's slightly different for Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia's coastline is continuously along the Red Sea. But the Emiratis would likely use it as part of a longer-term security cooperation and defense procurement deal. Say, this is why the French have established their Indian Ocean base in Abu Dhabi as a way to help strengthen that partnership, to help extend security. They have tried on 2 occasions to establish a Chinese military base within Abu Dhabi, which is extremely contentious in the US. But you can see the different methods and modes being used to advertise themselves and their own positions for the use of other states. What could be really leveraged here strongly by the Emiratis is the fact that due to this Iranian assistance, Chinese assistance, if this is to be the case, the Houthis now possess a long-range strike capability, as well as an intelligence sophistication, but are still a non-state actor. They represent somewhat of a tangible threat to that of a state, but they are relatively untrained by comparison to Iran, by comparison to these other international threats, who could do so much more. That's why the Emiratis will press the initiative and state why it's so crucial to disarm the Houthis, to deny this hostile fixture from developing within the region, and while also keeping American or Western security interests at heart. They will keep using these opportunities as advertisements for Emirati orientation or sponsorship of initiatives.
So let me go over that topic. You kind of slightly touched the Chinese, but we received questions both before the webinar and during the webinar about the Chinese involvement, potential involvement in the crisis, also the Russians. And knowing the UAE position, which is more neutral, I would say, or more open to deal with China and Russia. How do you see those two countries' potential involvement in this crisis? Do you see the Chinese or the Russians being invited as a potential de-escalators vis-a-vis Iran, the Houthis, or do you see this as a no-go, this is not going to happen?
So with the Chinese, as we can look back, was it just over a year ago when the Chinese sponsored the restoration of diplomatic ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This is something which could feasibly occur again. but we do have to remember, sorry, that within the next 12 months, we have elections here in the UK, but also in the US, where there could be significantly different administrations which influence the international relations of the region. But China could certainly play a de-escalating role with regards to Iran. For Russia, however, there's a slightly different component because of the military-industrial partnership and their need for weapons within Ukraine. It's therefore less likely that the Russians would be willing or would be happy to encourage Iran to again put pressure on the Houthis to maybe stop some of this level of aggression. But for both Russia and China, it doesn't really suit them. It doesn't suit their position for conflict to end, because that would just simply make the West look stronger. They want this insecurity to develop, because the longer it goes on, the longer it pressures the US into relenting its support for Israel, into the perspective that you speak about international human rights law, but you're not applying it uniformly. The longer this goes on, the weaker the West looks. And that's really a dangerous game, because there's nothing that can be done seriously to rectify this.
Oren, can I make? Sorry, Oren, can I make a quick comment on this?
Who is that? Noel?
Fernando.
Fernando. You were talking from two devices. Okay. Yes, Fernando.
So to Matt's point about China, it is interesting to note that those who are tracking the strikes by Houthis and how the navies respond to the strikes, it's interesting to note that the Chinese Navy vessels in the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea have been targeted for criticism because they were very close to some of the ships being targeted, and they failed to respond. They failed to protect these civilian commercial ships, even though the Chinese are there as part of the Maritime Task Force, anti-smuggling task force, not necessarily under the Operation Prosperity Guardian. So to Matt's point, the Chinese are like, yeah, we saw the missiles and the drones coming, but that was not our responsibility. So it is interesting to see how the Chinese are taking their role, presenting their role, keeping in mind that the Iranian-Saudi deal was signed in Beijing, and that the Iranians promised to influence the Houthis. Back to your point of whether there are proxies or own actors, the Iranians promised in public to stop the flow of weapons to the Houthis and to help facilitate the talks between and the Houthis. So China is definitely, a lot of people had a lot of high expectations for the Chinese diplomacy, and since the Beijing meetings, we've seen that it's really hasn't produced much.
So Fernando, I actually want to go now to kind of from this bigger picture. We dealt with the regional, the UAE, Saudi Arabia. We dealt with the international actors, US, China, Russia. I want to take it a little bit to a more lower altitude, focusing on the internal Yemeni dynamics. How do you see those dynamics evolving from an escalation, de-escalation impact on the situation? Do we see any kind of a scenario in which they will play any role, the Yemeni government? Do you see any situation in which this could lead to an escalation, de-escalation, that conflict, or that conflict to for that sake the dynamics of the internally in Yemen to have any impact on the Houthis and their decision when it comes to the Red Sea? How do you see that evolving when it comes to the crisis at the Red Sea?
Definitely, Yemeni actors see it an escalation. Number one, the Houthis have been mobilizing and redeploying troops from their positions closer into the southern, quote unquote, liberated area. So the southern forces claim to have confronted the Houthis in west, where the Houthis attempting to re-enter Shebwa through Bayhan. The missile that was fired 2 days ago, a misfire, landed in a southern province. This could have landed in a village. The Houthis are also continue to engage in Taiz, continue to surround the city of Taiz, continue to cause casualties in Taiz. They continue to move in Marib. So definitely for the Houthi rivals, the Yemeni rivals on the ground, the Houthis are escalating. One of the points that I made is that the Houthi escalation in the Red Sea against these ships and everything are directly impacting the legitimate government of Yemen today and the Southern Council, ambitions, primarily because their actions continue to create an economic crisis across the liberated areas, right? The Houthis have basically shut down oil production in Marib and the southern areas because there is no way to export gas or oil because the Houthis have targeted the facilities and the tankers, the oil tankers entering. This creates a complete dependency on Saudi Arabia for the legitimate government's budget. This is a strategy by Houthis. These are not unintended consequences from Houthi actions. These are direct consequences of Houthi actions, and Houthis use these tactics to pressure Saudi Arabia to delegitimize the legitimate government of Yemen and saying, look, we can operate. There's petrol on our stations. The dollar is only 500 rials, whereas in liberated areas it's 1,200 or 1,400 rials to the dollar, et cetera, et cetera. So we are the legitimate government. We can manage better than Rashad al-Ali and the council. Again, just yesterday, the head of the SDC, who's in Davos, made a comment, both praising the U.S. British action and criticizing it, right? When he was asked about the airstrikes, he praised them. He said, thank you. This is a way control the Houthis. This is a way to degrade their capabilities. But at the same time, where have these strikes been the last 9 years? Meaning the STC would like to see the US and the Brits a little bit more engaged in direct military operations. I criticize this point because there is a misunderstanding of US military policy, foreign policy. This is not a war for the US. The US administration has not declared war since Obama in Yemen. It is not an actor. It is not a participant in the war. It provides material, weapons to its partners, but it is not an active participant in the war. President Biden has been, just as Obama was, under pressure under the War Powers Act from his own party. If he further engages the conflict in Yemen. I think my analysis just last week, when the airstrikes were announced, my analysis was this action by the US, non-related to the civil war in Yemen, actually something that Saudi and the Yemeni rival and the Yemeni actors could leverage against the Houthis to create a shift in the balance of power on the ground. The US, in retaliation for the attacks on ships, can only target military facilities from the Houthis. Just so happens that the Houthis are using the same missiles and the same drones that they use to attack Saudi Arabia, right? Or the Yemeni rivals in Marib and Shabwa. So the fact that the fact that the US in this operation are targeting Houthi missile and drone capabilities should benefit the actors on the ground because it reduces the Houthi arsenal on missiles and drones and their ability to, replenish that arsenal, while at the same time the US and international navies are continuing their counter-smuggling operations in the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Aden, which we just had 2 incidents this week. The one involving the 2 Navy SEALs that were lost, off Somalia, and then another cache that was just seized in the Arabian Gulf. So, for my opinion, while Saudi Arabia, rightly, as Matt and Dr. Noah have mentioned, that Saudi Arabia is apprehensive on the strikes and now warns of re-escalation, I'm pretty sure that, in mind that Lindsey Graham and the head of the Intelligence Committee visited Mohammed bin Salman and Al-Ula just days before the strikes. Okay, so to say that the strikes took place without informing the Saudis is also very naive. The Saudis are very engaged. They're demanding more and military engagement by the U.S. So I believe that strategically, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, sees these airstrikes as beneficial to his position vis-a-vis the Houthis in the midterm. We're talking about what your comment on the talks.
So I wanna ask you, Noel, if you can give me your perspective looking forward, um, acknowledging that from what we understand from this webinar is that the Houthis have seen the situation, the war in Gaza, as an opportunity to leverage it in order to basically promote their own interests on the ground and vis-a-vis the Saudis and the UAE. How do you see the situation moving forward? Do you see it escalating, or do you see it de-escalating now that the U.S. Coalition has started to basically act in the region?
I mean, do you escape in terms of Yemeni internal politics or regionally in this case?
Well, I will divide the question into two. The first one: do you see a de-escalation when it comes to attacking ships and naval navigation in the Red Sea? And two, within Yemen itself, within the internal dynamics, are we likely to see a de-escalation or an escalation now that the U.S. coalition has interfered in the situation?
I think there's. I mean, I think Fernando made the point. I mean, the STC, for example, one of the things the STC did was to suggest that the Yemeni Coast Guard should be revived and take part in these Red Sea operations. I mean, that there are elements within the in the PLC which would like this, but I mean, I think a couple of points here I'd just like to make is that the PLC is not a particularly effective organization. It's got military power, but it's divided with the main elements in it wanting different things, and that is impaired its effectiveness set up nearly 18 months ago, but it hasn't made much progress. Another thing to keep in mind, although this is more perhaps for internal politics, is that Saudi Arabia has not been very good at managing the PLC and at managing the situation in Saudi Arabia. Its strategy is very clear, but the implementation hasn't been very effective, so that the government in Aden has not had the resources it needed, and the Saudis have not been able to make the Yemeni actors do what they want. So this is a factor in this. And from the other aspect, I think, looking from the Houthi perspective, the only thing that stopped them taking Marib in 2 years ago, and bearing in mind Marib is the main center of Yemeni gas, and that the oil resources are in Hadramaut and Shabwa in the south. The Houthis would need, any government in Yemen is going to need access to those resources, and the Houthis don't have them. But they try to take them in Marib, and and there's a military, in effect, a military stalemate. But what stopped the Houthis taking it was the Saudi Air Force. And whether with the Saudis now potentially out of it, there's an opportunity for the Houthis to do this in future. I'm not sure what the UAE Air Force would do, but I mean it's that's a factor in this. I think the other thing to keep in mind, I know it's actually the center of being anti-Israeli, anti-American. It's the center of the Houthi strategy. If you look at the Saka, you'll see it's down with America, down with Israel, curse to America, curse to Jews. So what they're doing in Gaza is entirely consistent with what they with this. It's convenient maybe in other ways, but it is entirely consistent. And I think in a sense that they shouldn't be dismissed as not meaning it. I think they do mean it. So whether I know the next step is, I don't know quite what the US and UK and others can do next, because the Houthis don't need to be completely, as long as they continue to send a few rockets onto the sea and attack ships, every few days, you find that the major shipping companies are still not going through. And so far, at least, the coalition hasn't been able to demonstrate to the shipping companies that it's safe enough for most of them to use it. And I don't know what the next step is. I mean, the Houthis presumably could do this for some time, and I don't know how long, how effective the attacks were in degrading. They clearly have degraded the facilities, but a lot of the stuff will have been dispersed, and the Houthis don't need that much to escalate. So they will. I think they will continue to escalate until, as they say, the situation in Gaza is solved. I mean, this is and they can. The signs are they can keep doing this, and I'm not sure what more than the Americans and the British can do. This final step has been the designation, which I don't. We talked about it earlier. So that's how I see the situation.
Matthew, I have a question here. I'm gonna a little bit play with it because it revolves the questions we had about Iran and Russia, but China and Russia, and that is obviously this is something that is impacting the trade of oil and gas because of the cost it has on the shipping lanes and the insurance and so on and so on. Can we see this? When we see the UAE slash Saudi Arabia leveraging their power within OPEC, leveraging their strength in order to force either Iran or maybe even I would say Iran basically to pressure the Houthis to scale down? Is that something that you can see happening in some way or form?
Personally, no. And I think Noel touched on it slightly at the end. The issue is, it is no matter how hard some try to disconnect it or to enforce the connection, it is still inexplicably linked with the war in Gaza. And for Saudi Arabia or the UAE, of course they want security and stability, but at the same time making public statements to stop a group that claims to be acting in support of Hamas or in support of the Palestinian right to statehood. This is a very difficult or nearly impossible argument for them to make without alienating or angering some parts of either their domestic population or the global Muslim community. It's much harder for Saudi Arabia than it is for the UAE in this regard. But the centering on security, there was an estimation, I believe last week, that this will have a 13% impact on India's economic GDP, something around this line. It's impacting these global economies, but for anyone to go and step up, or for the Gulf states' oil and gas to be used as somewhat of a weapon to leverage Iran into relenting, you are then immediately taking responsibility. You're taking ownership for events when that is the last thing either those in Abu Dhabi or in Riyadh want to do, because they also have the intention and necessity to connect it to events in Gaza. Does that make sense, Oren?
Yep, 100%. And I want to ask you from the perspective again to maybe taking it to an escalation. Mm-hmm. Is there a chance that the Saudis and the Emirates are going to basically see this, I wouldn't say an opportunity, but maybe as one of the only strategies that is left over to go back to the war in Yemen and to escalate the situation on the ground to what it was before the Saudi detain and before the negotiations between the Saudis and the Houthis? Do you see this as something that now that there's a U.S.-led coalition in the area, a naval coalition, do you see that as something that they may be considering to bring back and to escalate the situation back to what it was before the situation was de-escalated last year.
I certainly believe that Mohammed bin Salman and Saudi Arabia have learned a very tough lesson through this, and that it certainly will not be at the top of their wish list or agenda, no matter the fact that this is a strong position or a strong opportunity to do so. But the public sentiment, the risk, the damage that this will cause is insurmountable. It's something they will not be able to handle. Nor the UAE, the deaths, the martyrs that they had within their armed forces from their official military involvement in Yemen, caused significant domestic upheaval, unrest. It caused a lot of unhappiness. Again, I reiterate the point of such a small community of Emiratis is extremely fragile, and they cannot jeopardize that anymore. So it's unlikely that either would go and send their militaries in. The Emiratis would, if based on track record, they would try to find a third proxy actor, mercenaries, African trained soldiers to complement it. But the likelihood of this occurring is quite limited, because they would want to find a legitimate cause to empower the STC as part of their long-term project for a split Yemen. That is their dream. But if they sent Russian Wagner troops in, or something of the equivalent, this would completely weaken and undermine any attempt to bring the international community towards it. The Saudis, they started the war, they failed to achieve the objectives, and they're trying to find a way out of it. They're trying to avoid any more responsibility, but it comes with the territory, really.
So at this point, we have 5 minutes. So very shortly, Fernando, I would like your closing remarks, and if you can, in 2 minutes, focus on two things. One, are we likely to see an escalation or de-escalation in the Red Sea arena? And two, are we likely to see an escalation or de-escalation in the internal Yemenis conflict?
Sure. Definitely in the Red Sea, we need to focus on how Saudi Arabia engages the Houthis, let's say this week. It is very interesting to note that aside from the foreign minister's comments about, being concerned over the strikes, we have not seen any reports about communication between Saudi Arabia and the Houthi representatives, re their peace negotiation, or even the UN envoy's efforts to kickstart his peace plan, right, which was announced on December 23rd last year. So we need to focus on what the Saudis are going to do this week, once again, to kickstart their talks, because as Dr. Brehony mentioned, it is their primary interest to advance their economic plan, Mohammed bin Salman's vision. And this directly affects their business model right now, because we got to keep in mind that this is affecting the Suez Canal, and both the Emiratis and the Saudis are pumping money into Egypt, right? And then there could be instability in Egypt as revenue decreases, and the ports in Western Saudi Arabia, Yanbu, etc., are suffering, or would suffer as well. Aramco would suffer, even though oil is going up. As far as the domestic front, I believe that the Southern forces are prepared to confront the Houthis once again along the de facto north and south line. We have to acknowledge that that the government forces are fragmented into three fronts, right? The Islah and PLC forces, the Southern forces, and then, as Matthew mentioned, the Red Sea forces under Tariq Saleh. Each one of them, unfortunately, prioritizes their own interests. The Southern forces have already said they're not willing to cross the de facto north-south line to pursue the Houthis. They are only defensive. They're going to protect the southern fronts against the Houthis. Tariq Saleh, to be honest, whether he has 10 or 20,000 troops, it's not sufficient to confront the Houthis. And let's keep in mind, let's be realistic. Tariq Saleh's troops cannot afford to have a single defeat against the Houthis. It would defeat their entire narrative. Then we have the Islah forces, which are concentrated in northern Hadramaut and Marib, as Dr. Knowles mentioned, protecting the refinery. And this is their base. The Islah has two bases, Marib, the city of Marib, and Taiz. These are fundamental for Islah to defend. So in the coming weeks, we can expect redeployments in the south. But again, the southern forces are waiting for the Houthis to march downward, to march towards them. They're not willing to pursue them. This is, again, a failure of the Saudi policy since April 1st, because the formation of the PLC, the primary public intention was to reunify the forces to fight the Houthis and push them back from the north-south de facto line. It's not happening.
So at this point, I'll move to you, Noel, in 2 minutes. If you can give me your perspective, are we looking into an escalation, de-escalation in the Red Sea? And same question, but only for the internal Yemenis conflict.
Well, I was going to suggest perhaps more like stalemate, because Gaza's not to end in this time, I assume. And unless the war ends, if war expands into Lebanon, I don't know. Presumably, the Houthis will continue to attack. There will be, I assume, again, more US-led strikes against them. But where they go beyond that, I don't know. It looks to me this is going to be a sort of game that continues for some time. The possibility of escalation, I suppose, is from Iran elsewhere, maybe in the Indian Ocean. I don't know. This is another possibility. It's interesting that Iranian attack on the US ship in oil. I think it was possibly one of the motives for doing it was just a reminder of what Iran could do. Can do, but so I don't in the Red Sea itself. I don't see an escalation other than what's going on at present. I think there's more likely to be something inside Yemen. It certainly blocked the peace process. The other factor I think has come up, but the Houthis have used this pause to recruit and rearm, and they're probably much stronger now than they were a year, 18 months ago. And that would be a factor that the Saudi-backed forces in the south would have to think about.
And Matthew, with you, I'm going to ask the same question a little bit from a different angle. Mm-hmm. Do you see a situation where the situation will escalate, de-escalate towards the UAE and Saudi Arabia? So we talked about Yemen, we talked about the Red Sea. Do you see a situation that is escalating towards or by Saudi Arabia and the Emirates?
So the Red Sea, I concur with Noel. This will it's likely that the attacks won't increase, particularly much, but what will happen is regional escalation, such as as Noel said, the hijacking of the American ship. There's been attacks and an attempted hijacking off the coast of India. The Iranian attacks in Kurdistan. It shows that there may be a concentration in one area, but it's being fought out in multiple different vicinities. Both Saudi Arabia and the UAE do want this to de-escalate. The Saudis are much more likely to offer the Houthis as much as they can do to get this to de-escalate. And this is why the internal process and the peace negotiations is central here. But what has happened in the past is the UAE has been targeted by Iran or its other proxies. And this is what could see a greater escalation, at least from the UAE. This wouldn't come in the form of the UAE armed forces military engaging against the Houthis on land, but they might increase their own shipping and maritime security operations. The Iranians have mined ships within Emirati waters. The Iranians often deploy midget submarines around Emirati ports, and they're quite commonly seen and harassed in places like Jebel Ali. So the Emiratis would probably try to find a way, an intelligence-led way to fight back or to push back against Iran and its other proxies.
So with this, we are concluding this webinar. We are a little bit extended it by 3 minutes from what we plan to, but we can go on and on with this topic for I think for another 2, 3, 4 hours and still have no much better understanding if the situation goes this way or the other. I think this is one of the conclusions here, that the situation is not only volatile, but can basically spilled and also deteriorated internally within Yemen, which is super interesting. The arena there is as complex as it gets. So I want to thank all of you distinguished speakers that participated in the webinar today. Noel, Matthew, Fernando, thank you so much for participating with us. I want to thank all of the people who joined in and logged into this webinar. Again, I'm going to remind you that we're going to issue a transcript of the webinar together with some top insights. We're going to post it on our social media, YouTube, and LinkedIn as well. And of course, we invite you to follow us for some of our upcoming webinars. We're going to have one, I believe, next Thursday about the implication of the Taiwanese elections on cross-strait relations, and a few more coming up ahead. So I want to thank everybody who joined us, and I want to thank Tali for organizing all of this. So thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. Thank you.